Welcome back to Top 5. Gunfire cracked through the air like the rage of a storm, a relentless barrage of noise that seemed to come from all directions. Sergeant David "Grim" Matthews pressed his back hard against the crumbling concrete wall of a bombed-out building. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. The whine of bullets zipping past his head was a familiar sound, a constant in the war-torn streets of this foreign land. He had been here for so long now that the sharp sounds of warfare felt like the background music to his life. "Grim! Incoming!" someone shouted, but the voice was drowned out by an explosion that shook the ground, sending dust and debris raining down on him. The blast left his ears ringing, and as the smoke cleared, he caught sight of Private Jansen, barely 20, a kid with wide, terrified eyes, screaming as he lay on the ground, shrapnel embedded deep in his torso. David's instincts screamed at him to move, to help the young man, but there was nothing he could do. He was pinned down, with enemy fighters closing in from all sides. They were outnumbered, overwhelmed. Around him, men he'd fought beside for months, men he'd joked with, shared meals with, were dropping like flies. A bullet struck Lieutenant Parker in the head, killing him instantly. Sergeant O'Connell took a round to the leg, then another to the chest as he tried to crawl away. The air was thick with the smell of blood and cordite, the acrid stench of death. Jansen's scream turned into a gurgle as blood filled his throat, his eyes rolling back as life drained from him. David watched it all in brutal clarity, his training forcing him to compartmentalize the horror. But no amount of discipline could make him forget it. "Grim, we need to fall back." Corporal Decker's voice cut through the chaos, desperation seeping into his usually calm tone. David knew he was right. They had to retreat or they'd all be slaughtered. But as he looked around, he realized there wasn't enough of them left to make a stand. His squad, once 30 strong, had been whittled down to a handful of men scattered in the rubble, fighting for their lives. The ground was soaked with blood, littered with the bodies of friends and enemies alike. With a grimace, David grabbed his radio. "All units, fall back to position Delta. Now!" He rose from his cover, firing blindly into the smoke-filled street as he ran toward Decker. They needed to regroup, find some semblance of order, but every corner they turned, every alley they ducked into, they were met with more resistance. The enemy had the numbers, the advantage. David could feel it, this was a losing battle. Suddenly, another explosion rocked the ground, throwing him into the side of a building. His helmet cracked against the wall, disorienting him. When he managed to open his eyes, everything was chaos. The sounds of battle were muffled, and all he could see were shadows moving through the smoke. He reached for his rifle, his hands trembling, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. But then he saw it, Corporal Decker, lying in the dirt, his body torn apart by a grenade blast. He wasn't moving. David's heart clenched in his chest as he stumbled forward, but before he could reach Decker, a hail of bullets forced him to dive behind a pile of debris. He was alone now, surrounded by death. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and by the time reinforcements finally arrived, the city was a graveyard. David stood alone in the middle of it, covered in blood, some of it his own, most of it not. He didn't flinch as the medics moved around him, collecting the bodies of his fallen comrades. The battle had been won, but it didn't feel like victory. All he could see were the faces of the men who hadn't made it out. The faces of the men he couldn't save. Years later, David sat at the kitchen table of his modest suburban home, staring blankly at the morning newspaper. The smell of coffee filled the air, but it did nothing to break the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. Carol, his wife, moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, humming softly as she made breakfast, unaware of the storm raging inside her husband's mind. Retirement had come as a shock to David. After 30 years in the military, it wasn't just a job he was leaving behind, it was his identity, his entire world. He had fought in wars, led men into battle, seen things that no one should ever have to see. And now, he was supposed to just live a normal life. It felt wrong, alien, like wearing a suit 2 sizes too small. The nights were the hardest. The nightmares always came, dragging him back to those blood-soaked streets, to the bodies of his men lying broken around him. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, his hands trembling as if they still held a weapon. He never told Carol about it. She wouldn't understand. How could she? She hadn't seen the things he'd seen. The therapist at the VA had told him it would take time, that healing wasn't linear, but David knew better. The war wasn't over. It was still raging inside his head, and there was no escape from it. For weeks, he tried to adapt. He attended his therapy sessions, went for long walks around the neighborhood, tried to find solace in the routine of daily life. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where he almost believed he could make it work. But the peace never lasted. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, the sound of fireworks exploded in the distance. David flinched, his fork clattering to the floor. For a split second, his mind went back to the war zone, to the explosions, the gunfire, the screams. His breath quickened, his vision narrowing as the familiar rush of adrenaline surged through him. Carol's voice pulled him back, her hand gently resting on his arm, but the moment had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. A few days later, it happened again. He and Carol had gone out for a quiet evening in the city, a rare occasion for them. They were walking down a busy street when a car backfired nearby, the sudden, sharp sound triggering something deep within David. His body went rigid, his heart hammering in his chest as the world around him transformed. In his mind, the city was gone, replaced by the war-torn streets of a battlefield. The people walking past were no longer civilians, they were enemy soldiers, closing in on him. His breath quickened, his vision tunneled, and his hand instinctively reached for the knife he always carried with him. He was back in the fight, surrounded, outnumbered. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the roar of combat. David? Carol's voice was distant, barely registering through the fog of his delusions. To him, she was no longer his wife. She was the enemy, closing in to finish him off. Without hesitation, he lunged at her, his knife flashing in the dim light of the street. Carol screamed, but the sound was lost in the chaos of his mind. His movements were automatic, trained, precise. It wasn't until her body hit the ground, blood pooling beneath her, that the fog began to lift. David stood there, his breath ragged, staring down at his wife's lifeless body. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering to the pavement, as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The war wasn't over, it had followed him home. The days after Carol's death were a blur. David wandered the streets, lost in a haze of confusion and guilt. He could no longer distinguish between reality and the battlefield in his mind. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. He barricaded himself in their home, turning it into a fortress, convinced that the enemy was coming for him. The police came to arrest him, but in his delusion, they were enemy soldiers, and he treated them as such. He fought them off, firing wildly at anyone who came too close. In his mind, the city had become a battlefield, and he was the last soldier standing. Neighbors became enemies, strangers were threats, and the world outside his door was a war zone. David knew, deep down, that he was broken. He had tried to fight it, to keep the war at bay, but it had consumed him. His mind was shattered, and no one was coming to save him. One cold evening, as sirens blared in the distance, David climbed to the roof of his house, his rifle in hand. He stared out at the city, his mind still trapped in the horrors of war. The guilt of what he had done to Carol weighed heavily on him, but there was no going back now. There was only one way to end the pain. He sat down, the barrel of the rifle pressed beneath his chin. His finger hovered over the trigger as he took one last, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then, with a final gunshot, Sergeant David Matthews found the piece that had eluded him for so long.